While most 9-year-olds are trading stickers or learning their multiplication tables, Rena Powell spends her days in near silence, repairing broken walkie-talkies, sketching circuits in a dog-eared notebook, and riding the city bus beside her mother to the polished glass headquarters of Halcyon Systems. Her mother, Danielle, cleans offices there. No one knows Rena exists. No one ever sees her, no one but herself. She always walked 6 steps behind her mother, not because she was told to, but because she liked watching how Danielle moved through spaces that didn't belong to her. Her mother never rushed, never looked up, never acted like she belonged in the hushed, chrome-plated corridors of Halcyon. She was invisible on purpose. Rena had learned that being invisible could be a kind of power, especially in places that didn't want you seen. She clutched her frayed backpack close, careful not to let the broken zipper catch on her hoodie. Inside it, her most important possessions, a spiral notebook, a broken digital watch, and a cracked USB drive that no longer worked but somehow felt like a piece of her. As they entered through the staff entrance, the security guard didn't even glance her way. He never did. Danielle murmured, 41, and Rena knew the drill. Same floor, same shift, no questions. She peeled off and settled into her usual corner of the lobby, legs swinging on the plush bench as she opened her notebook and flipped past pages of sketched motherboards and imagined command lines. It was the only part of her day where she could pretend she belonged. By the time her mother disappeared behind the elevators, Rena was deep into designing a pretend processor she imagined could decode signals without direct input, something that listened instead of pulled. Her pencil darted across the page, each stroke following an internal logic no one had ever taught her. She barely registered the noise around her. Heels clicking past, the snap of tablet covers, clipped conversations about morning stand-ups and missed syncs. All of it blurred into the backdrop. What mattered was the image forming in her head, something that could read broken code and reconstruct meaning. She'd seen a glimpse of it once in a bootlegged video on a forum she wasn't supposed to access. The specifics had faded, but the idea had stuck. She began drawing not just the imagined chip, but the symbols she'd need to control it, her own language of looping syntax and faux function calls. It was while she was halfway through writing a fake header file that the first flicker happened. The lobby lights dimmed. She stopped mid-line. A second later, every screen went black in unison. Silence rippled through the room, followed by rising voices and sharp, impatient tapping. Rena didn't move. She heard it clearly. Someone said, "Breach," and then everything changed. The polished lobby unraveled in moments. A man near reception slapped his tablet on the counter, yelling into his earpiece. Another employee jogged past, whispering about remote access failure. There were murmurs about servers, DNS lockouts, diagnostic failures. No one had a clear answer. Rena stayed still. She knew what happened to kids who got noticed. They got told to leave. So she blended into the bench, her eyes absorbing everything. A trio of engineers argued near the elevators. Kernel override, malware vector. She recognized the word malware. She didn't know the full infrastructure, but she could read their panic. They weren't troubleshooting, they were guessing. She started writing on a clean page. Questions, theories, things she would try. Start by isolating breach vectors, internal or external. Look for unusual traffic signatures. Use a shell diagnostic. The adults weren't asking those questions. They were throwing guesses into locked doors and hoping one opened. For the first time, Rena felt something unsettling. She didn't think she could fix it, but she knew they couldn't. She remembered helping her cousin recover a dead laptop using a patched bootloader she coded herself. No one taught her how. She just figured it out. Like now, her pencil moved faster, not drawing anymore, but building. Her thoughts coalesced into a logic web, not imagining a fake device this time, but tracing the outline of something real, something buried beneath Halcyon's failure. The screens hadn't exploded. They'd been frozen, locked. That meant the system still existed beneath it all. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been caged. That realization hit her like the drop before a fall. The bones of the network were still there, waiting for someone who knew how to see. A low alarm began pulsing somewhere above, more like an alert than an emergency. But Rena barely noticed. Her thoughts had tunneled. She connected what she'd heard: triple firewalls after Zurich, failed DNS pings, recursive lockouts. It sounded like someone had hijacked the system without brute force. Subtle, clean, which meant this wasn't just code. This was someone's logic. A person had built this breach, and no one in the room seemed to recognize its shape. Rena stood up, moving closer to the conference room glass, where a half-dozen engineers and execs crowded around blinking monitors. One screen showed a map, completely red. A choked voice mentioned Ghost Protocol, a breach that mimics legitimate user behavior. She knew they were wrong, not just because of what they were missing, but because of how they were looking. They were staring at errors and logs as if waiting for them to confess. They weren't asking questions. They were hunting ghosts in the wrong house. And then it happened. Before she could stop herself, the words came out. "Have you checked the socket overflow loop?" Her voice was small, but sharp. The pause was immediate. Heads turned. One man scoffed. "What did she say?" Another chuckled. "Whose kid is this?" But one woman didn't laugh. She blinked slowly and just watched. Rena felt her face flush. She regretted it immediately. She broke her own rule. Don't get noticed. Don't speak. Her hands curled around her notebook, and she backed away, already planning her exit. But someone else had noticed. Not one of the loud executives. A quiet figure in the back. Young, uncertain, but curious. His name tag said Noel Rivera. He wasn't typing. He wasn't shouting. He was watching. Their eyes met for half a second. He didn't smirk. He tilted his head, like he was listening, really listening. And that's when Rena realized. She wasn't guessing. The word she'd said, the socket overflow loop, that wasn't some wild stab. She'd seen it before. Not in school. Not in textbooks. In a bootleg simulation on a cracked laptop in a corner of Garden Crest Apartments. She remembered the exact error structure. It was nested, recursive, elegant. She hadn't been taught. She had lived it. And no one else in this room seemed to know what it looked like. Someone whispered, "We're listening to a kid now." But Noel stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "Her suggestion makes sense," he said simply. "It's a logical entry point for a recursive lockout." Then he looked at the others and added, "Let's not pretend anyone here has a better idea." And just like that, the room shifted. Not fully, not obviously, but enough. Enough for her words to stay in the air. Enough for the system to finally notice that someone new had spoken. Rena had never seen so many important people in one place, all looking so completely lost. Inside the glass-walled room beside the central stairwell, a swarm of expensive suits and hurried hoodies crowded around monitors flashing red. Some had phones glued to their ears. Others just stared at the screens as if willing the errors to reverse. One display pulsed like a dying heartbeat, crimson overtaking every node on a network map. Rena inched closer, sneakers soundless on the tile, clutching her notebook to her chest. No one noticed her, not yet. One man, older, red-faced, slammed his palm on the table. "This can't be internal," he barked. "We triple firewalled this entry point after Zurich." A woman beside him, calm but pale, responded, "Then it's a ghost protocol. It's mimicking user behavior. It's too clean to be brute force." Rena didn't catch every technical phrase, but she knew what wasn't being said. They were chasing shadows, and none of them were asking the right questions. They were reacting, not diagnosing. The panic in the room wasn't loud. It was tight, clenched, frantic in a way only people with power feel when control slips. Someone tried a manual override. Rena saw the flick of fingers over keys. Then the dull thud of another rejection screen. "Level 4 encryption loop, who even builds this crap?" Another muttered, "Someone who wants us dead in the water." Someone else replied. Then a voice called out from behind the door, "Can we reach Colin? We need top-level override." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. The CEO. Rena didn't know what floor he was on, but everyone clearly feared what would happen when he found out. She didn't mean to speak. Truly, she didn't. But something about watching them drown in their own systems tugged it out of her. "Did you check the socket overflow loop?" she'd asked. And now that voice, her voice, had cracked open the air like a pin dropped in a silent room. Most brushed it off. "Whose kid is this?" someone muttered. Another snorted. Maintenance must have left the door open. But someone else had heard her. Really heard her. Noel Rivera, the quiet intern standing behind the primary cluster of engineers, didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He tilted his head like he was parsing a line of code that had just made sense. Rena felt heat climb to her ears. She took a step back, retreating behind a pillar near the room's edge. She shouldn't have said anything. Her mom would panic if she knew Rena had wandered this far into the executive levels. Her grip tightened on her notebook, ready to disappear into the background again. And yet Noel kept watching. Not like a guard, not like a teacher, more like a peer. His gaze wasn't invasive. It was patient, like he was turning her words over in his head, testing their fit against the system in front of him. Something stirred in Rena's chest, a flicker of something dangerous. Maybe she was right. She remembered where she'd seen that loop before. Not in class, not in any formal training, but in an old simulation program she'd found on a cracked public computer at BiteSpot, the internet cafe across from Garden Crest Apartments. She'd spent 3 nights rewriting the interface just to get it to boot. On the 4th night, she broke into its diagnostics and saw the same recursive lockout trigger she was watching Halcyon's engineers fumble with now. She hadn't memorized it. She'd internalized it. And now it was happening again, but real. One of the older engineers paced in frustrated circles, muttering about dead ends. "We're throwing darts in the dark," another said. "None of the recovery scripts are sticking. And we can't reach Colin," added a third. "If the metrics tank during this investor call, he's going to explode." All of it should have made Rena feel small, but instead it made her furious. Not in the loud way, not like anger, more like clarity. These people had titles and lanyards and credentials, but they didn't know what they were up against, and they certainly weren't close to solving it. Their guesses weren't just wrong, they were loud wrong. She saw it clearly now. This wasn't brute force. This wasn't random. It was elegant. Something had nested deep inside the system, not crashing it, freezing it, preventing interaction without erasing the core. It was someone's design, a mind behind it, and Rena recognized it. She didn't know who had built it, but she understood its logic. It was subtle, clever, patient. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Her hand hovered near her pencil again, jotting quick fragments, diagnostic trails, fail-safe structures, layered admin shells. No one noticed her, crouched low behind the column, but one voice finally broke the tension. The woman who'd blinked slowly earlier said, almost to herself, "We should check what she said." Another voice, male, defensive, snapped, "Are we seriously taking cues from a janitor's kid now?" And that's when Noel finally stepped forward, not aggressively, not performatively, just stepped forward and said with perfect calm. Her question made sense. It fits the lockout profile, especially if the attacker wanted to simulate user failure. Now everyone turned, not toward Rena, toward Noel. He glanced once in her direction, then back to the room. Let's not pretend any of us have a better theory. Silence. Rena's heart thumped like a machine left running in the dark. She didn't understand corporate hierarchies, but she understood what had just happened. Her idea hadn't been dismissed. It had been entered into the system, not as noise, as input. She slid back further behind the column, eyes fixed on the light bleeding out from the glass wall. Noel still hadn't looked away. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't seeking approval. He was steady, anchored, like someone who understood what it meant to say something no one expected to matter and still say it. Rena sat on the floor again, opened her notebook, and scribbled, "Socket overflow loop." If they weren't going to test it, she would. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. She'd seen this exact loop in simulations. The kind designed to confuse diagnostics, rear out log traces, mimic benign scripts. She didn't understand every term for what she saw, but she knew what it was. A trap, built to look like normal failure. and Halcyon's entire division had walked right into it. The IT lead, tall, sarcastic, with a permanently unimpressed expression, muttered, "Sure, why not? Maybe the janitor's kid will solve what 20 of us couldn't." A few others chuckled. It wasn't kind laughter, but it wasn't strong enough to stop what had already shifted. No one stopped her. Noel, still quiet, pulled out a chair. "Here," he said softly. "You'll have to stand on it." "Terminal's too high." Rena said nothing, just nodded once, climbed onto the chair like a diver preparing for the edge of the world, and placed her notebook gently on the desk. Her hands shook, but not from fear, from readiness. The room behind her held its breath. She hadn't meant to be here, but now she was, and the system was still burning. And Rena, silent, sharp, and entirely unseen until now, was the only one not waiting for permission. Rena didn't touch the keyboard at first. She just stared at the terminal, silently calibrating her position like someone aligning gears in their head. The screen displayed a wall of locked command prompts, failed boot scripts, and broken recovery paths. Most of the diagnostic tools were frozen mid-query. It was like staring into a maze that someone else had already walked through and jammed every exit behind them. But Rena didn't flinch. Her fingers hovered for a few seconds, then slowly began to move. Not like she was typing, but like she was remembering. Noel stood beside her, arms crossed loosely, saying nothing. The IT lead, the one with the perpetual smirk, muttered from behind, "So what's the plan? She's gonna play Minesweeper until the power cuts." No one laughed. Not really, because as Rena started to type, something shifted. She didn't ask for help, didn't request a login key or wait for a walkthrough. She typed in a command string that didn't belong to any script they deployed. And yet, the system responded. A blink. A prompt opened. Not loud, not flashy, just there. Noel leaned closer. "Did you just—" he began, but stopped. He knew what he saw, and so did everyone else. Someone from the security team squinted at the screen. "What the hell kind of override is that?" A woman near the back whispered. "That prompt's not even supposed to exist. It's buried under admin layer fallback." The IT lead blinked slowly. There's no way she just got in, but she had, with a sequence no one recognized. "No credentials. No admin passfrase." Just a command string so obscure it looked like gibberish until it worked. Noel turned his head slightly. "She authenticated," he said quietly. A ripple went through the room. Someone gasped. Someone else swore under their breath. One engineer leaned forward. "With what? How?" Another voice, somewhere near the doorway, answered with dread. "That string. It's tied to Colin's personal cipher." Silence, like someone had pulled the sound from the air. Behind the wall of glass, up on the executive floor, Colin Thorne stood completely still, watching the screens in the war room blink in and out. His tablet had frozen, his jaw clenched tighter with every second of system silence. Investors were already leaving the virtual call. PR was scrambling. Someone was whispering to legal. He wasn't listening. He turned to his assistant. "Why is the system still down?" he asked through clenched teeth. The assistant, barely older than Noel, stammered, "Sir, there's someone working on it." Colin narrowed his eyes. "Who?" A beat of silence. Then, "She's a kid, sir, from the lobby. Janitorial staff's daughter, I think." Colin didn't speak. He turned and walked out of the room without another word. His footsteps like a countdown. Downstairs, Rena was already 3 steps deeper into the system shell, navigating with speed that made it look rehearsed. She wasn't consulting her notes. Her eyes flicked from screen to code to log and back again, as if the rhythm of the machine lived in her body. The corrupted files were masking themselves behind false extensions. Dummy code pretending to be protocol flags. But Rena saw the pattern. This wasn't brute force. This was something smarter. A photo on the wall above the terminal caught her eye. A child, maybe 4, sitting on a man's shoulders. The frame beneath it read, "Amelia, 4 a.m. Welcome to the world." The watch on the man's wrist matched the one Colin had worn when he marched into the lobby earlier. She smiled faintly, just once. Then she typed for Amelia. The system blinked. A new window opened, this time visibly. Elias whispered. She just got past the core lock. The IT lead didn't say a word, just watched her hands like they were defusing a bomb. And then the moment cracked. 2 building security officers appeared at the glass doors. One tapped the panel to request access. The other was already murmuring into an earpiece. Rena didn't notice, but Noel did. He turned, alarm in his chest. Then, without thinking, he moved, stepped directly in front of her, planting himself like a firewall. He wasn't big, he wasn't loud, but his stance was clear. His voice didn't waver. She's the only one making progress. The guards paused. One looked back at the hallway, and then Colin Thorne stepped into view, cold, calculating, watching the girl who was still typing as if she were rewriting the story of his company with her bare hands. His voice was iron. You're telling me you've given access to a child with no clearance, no training, no authorization? Noel didn't blink. I'm telling you she's in deeper than anyone else and hasn't triggered a single failsafe. Colin's eyes narrowed. This system cost us $36 million to build, and now it's in the hands of a janitor's daughter. One of the engineers spoke softly, almost reverently. She's already isolated anomalies in the second cluster. We couldn't even locate them. Another added, she found the admin shell. She didn't break it. She found it. Still, Rena didn't look up. She was chasing something in the code now. Something she recognized not in syntax but in rhythm. Whoever had written this had buried their logic deep, like a trap layered inside a lullaby. It was beautiful, terrifying, precise. The attacker wasn't trying to steal anything. They were trying to prove something. They wanted to be seen by someone like her. Her hands moved faster, not frantic, focused. She was mapping the breach like a story unfolding in reverse. This wasn't sabotage. It was a message, and she was the only one who could read it. Someone whispered, "She's breaking through another layer." The room grew still again. Rena was now working in silence, wrapped in syntax and structure, surfing logic waves no one else could even see. Her body was still, her breath calm. She had stopped hearing the room. She was inside the machine now. Colin watched, arms crossed, jaw set. Then he said coldly, "Get her out." The room tensed. Noel stepped closer to Rena, blocking her fully. "She's the reason we're not locked out forever. She's not a threat. She's the way through." Colin's expression darkened. "She is a liability." But someone else spoke, an older systems architect, one who hadn't said much all morning. "No," he said. "She's the only one here who saw the system the way the attacker wanted it to be seen. That's not liability. That's alignment." That word alignment hung there like prophecy. And finally, Rena paused. Just a second. Her hand hovered above a terminal line that didn't belong. A malformed function. A recursive loop designed to mirror itself endlessly unless approached from a side path. She remembered something. A night in the cafe. A file called Digital Phantoms. Symmetric Disruption Methods. One line of commentary in the source. "It's not about breaking in. It's about becoming the door." She had copied that line once into her notebook, never knowing why it stuck with her. Now she knew. This breach, it wasn't random. It was a fingerprint. Someone had walked the same crooked path she had. And instead of learning how to heal systems, they had learned how to haunt them. Rena froze. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from recognition. She wasn't fixing a breach anymore. She was talking to someone through the code, and they were talking back. Noel noticed the change. "Rena," he said gently. She didn't turn. "I think I know who wrote this," she whispered. Noel blinked. "You mean like a team?" "No," she said. "I mean someone like me." Silence again, but it was different this time. Heavier. Because now everyone in the room knew. They weren't watching a kid type. They were watching a mirror face a shadow. Rena's fingers moved like they weren't attached to her anymore. just vessels for instinct. She had already sunk 3 layers deeper into Halcyon's architecture, peeling back corrupted scripts, false flags, and recursive triggers. But what she was seeing now wasn't just sabotage, it was precise, even graceful. This wasn't sloppy or angry, it was designed. Whoever wrote this had mapped every branch like a living structure, and more disturbingly, they had written it in a way only someone like her could follow. There were decoy loops that imitated system tools, decision trees that mimicked human error, even fake flags that baited the engineers into infinite loops. But Rena didn't fall for any of them. She didn't even hesitate. Her brain wasn't reading, it was listening. The deeper she went, the more familiar the logic felt. Too familiar. She recognized the pacing, the recursion style, even the variable names. Not exact copies, but close. Eerily close. And then it hit her. A specific malformed syntax, deliberate. A subtle error that wasn't wrong, just unique. Her heart stuttered. She had seen this before. Not in a manual. Not in any structured codebase. But on a forum. A long-abandoned corner of the internet she'd stumbled into late one night at ByteSpot, the crack screen cafe where she sometimes snuck in after dark. It had been buried deep in a thread called Digital Phantoms. Symmetric disruption methods. There had been no replies, just a file dump. A single comment. It's not about breaking in. It's about becoming the door. She had copied the script into a notebook and spent weeks pulling it apart on her cousin's half-dead PC. She hadn't understood all of it, but it had stuck with her. Haunted her even, because the code wasn't just clever, it was intimate. It had a personality. I seen ya too. Now, inside Halcyon's failing core, she was staring at something that felt like a sequel to that script. A mutation, a relative, maybe even an echo. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. The spell of pure logic snapped under the weight of realization. She wasn't fighting a stranger. She was reading a message. Someone out there had written this breach the way she might have. Had her life taken a slightly darker path. The silence around her changed. Noel must have sensed something. He leaned in slightly. "Rena?" he asked gently. "What is it?" Her voice came out flat, barely above a whisper. "I think I know who built this." He blinked. "You mean like a group?" No, her eyes didn't leave the screen. "I mean someone like me." The words dropped like stone. Noel didn't fill the silence. He didn't patronize her or ask for clarification. He understood just enough to know that what she'd just said wasn't guesswork. It was recognition, and that meant something dangerous was unfolding in front of them. She kept typing, but slower now, cautious. Her shoulders hunched slightly, not from fatigue but from weight. Emotional, not physical. The weight of seeing yourself reflected in something you fear. Because this wasn't just about fixing a breach anymore. This was a conversation. A coded exchange between two minds. One reaching out through destruction. The other answering with understanding. Rena's thoughts spiraled. If someone like her had written this, why? For what purpose? Revenge? Testing boundaries? Had they been overlooked too, unseen like her, but chosen a darker path? What would have happened if she hadn't had her notebook? If she hadn't had her mother's silence? Her cousin's old tower PC? If all she had was anger? She looked again at the looping logic gates. There was no aggression in them. No franticobariach. Just precision. Someone had done this not to cause chaos but to hide. To disappear inside the system like a ghost. To be heard without ever showing their face. That scared her more than any glitch or error message could. She thought of Amelia, the little girl in the photo frame, and wondered what the breach could have done if left unchecked. White files, leaked client data, shut down international systems. Maybe. Or maybe it would have just passed itself off as a network bug until someone blamed the wrong person. Either way, it wasn't an accident. It was intention. And now, Reno was following its trail to the center. She hesitated. For the first time in hours, she considered stepping back. Letting someone else take over. Letting the adults figure it out. But she already knew they couldn't. They didn't see the trail. Only she did. Noel didn't interrupt. He waited. Close but silent. He could tell she was wrestling with something deeper than code. Her posture had changed. Her hands hovered instead of gliding. She wasn't stuck, she was deciding. He knelt beside her quietly. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't stop either. Her hands began to move again. Not fast, deliberate. She searched logs and buried functions, traced the architecture with surgical precision. The breach had woven itself into the system like veins in a leaf. Every route led to another, and yet she kept going. And something in the room changed. The engineers, the IT staff, even Colin himself. They weren't looking at her like an intruder anymore. They were watching like she was leading them, even if they couldn't follow. "She's breaking through another layer," someone whispered. Someone else stepped closer. Even the IT lead, the one who'd rolled his eyes earlier, was now silent, all replacing skepticism. No one said it aloud, but the truth was clear. They were out of options, and Rena was the only one who wasn't afraid of the dark. Still, she didn't speak. Still, she typed. Her mind wasn't just solving, it was translating. The code wasn't random. It was emotional. There were fingerprints all over it. Not literal ones, structural ones. Whoever wrote this had done so from a place of isolation, of needing to be heard without ever being seen. And that, more than the breach itself, hit Rena hardest, because she knew that language. She spoke it. The red overlay on one of the core displays began to fade. One green pulse appeared, then another. Gasps rippled through the room. A few people swore quietly, others just stared. But Rena didn't look up. She was still working, pulling the last threads from the system, stitching its skeleton back together one line at a time. Upstairs, Colin hadn't moved, his arms still crossed, but his gaze was locked on her. Not angry, not even cold anymore, just intense, like he wasn't sure if he was seeing something miraculous or something threatening. Behind him, executives began whispering. One mentioned investor calls. Another started pacing like a man waking from a nightmare. But Colin just stared. No bite, no credence, no digital footprint, just a girl in a hoodie, solving what no one else could. And still, she didn't stop. She didn't look around for approval. She didn't wait for praise. She just fixed it. The whisper passed between departments like wildfire. "The janitor's daughter is doing something to the system." And upstairs, someone from legal asked if they needed to file a report. Colin didn't answer. His eyes were still on Rena, still watching the girl who had walked into his broken empire and started rebuilding it from the inside. And downstairs, with one final keystroke, Rena ended the loop. The breach collapsed. Not with fanfare, not with a bang, just with silence. And a single green line across the primary display. The system was back. And no one, not one person in that room, dared say a word. Purple circle fan 5/6. Big reveal. Transformed. Một chín trăm mười hai từ, chia thành năm đoạn liền mạch, đủ mạch hành động cảm xúc. Colin Thorne didn't clap, didn't speak. He didn't blink as the system came back online. The room around him murmured. Some people gasping, others whispering in disbelief. Executives reached for phones. Engineers turned in place like they were waking from a long nightmare. And someone even began to sob quietly near the corner terminal. But Colin didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the girl in the oversized hoodie, her hands hovering above the keyboard like she had just conducted an orchestra no one else could hear. Her name was Rena, no last name, not yet. His assistant had pulled it from the building logs. She came in with cleaning staff. No ID, no credentials, no presence in any system beyond a basic timestamp at the staff entrance. And yet she sat there, still and silent, her notebook closed at her side, the screen in front of her glowing with the unmistakable pulse of recovered core systems. Colin studied her. Not like a manager observing a candidate, but like a man trying to remember something he'd forgotten long ago. Her movements weren't practiced. They were natural, instinctual. He didn't understand how she knew what she knew, but he saw the aftermath. The disaster she had walked into and somehow, inexplicably, stitched back together. She didn't look up when someone muttered a thank you.
Colin Thorne didn't clap, didn't speak. He didn't blink as the system came back online. The room around him murmured, some people gasping, others whispering in disbelief. Executives reached for phones. Engineers turned in place like they were waking from a long nightmare. And someone even began to sob quietly near the corner terminal. But Colin didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the girl in the oversized hoodie, her hands hovering above the keyboard like she had just conducted an orchestra no one else could hear. Her name was Rena, no last name, not yet. His assistant had pulled it from the building logs. She came in with cleaning staff. No ID, no credentials, no presence in any system beyond a basic timestamp at the staff entrance. And yet she sat there, still and silent, her notebook closed at her side, the screen in front of her glowing with the unmistakable pulse of recovered core systems. Colin studied her. Not like a manager observing a candidate, but like a man trying to remember something he'd forgotten long ago. Her movements weren't practiced. They were natural, instinctual. He didn't understand how she knew what she knew, but he saw the aftermath. The disaster she had walked into and somehow, inexplicably, stitched back together. She didn't look up when someone muttered a thank you. She didn't speak when an engineer offered her water. She only stood, took a step back, and held her notebook to her chest like a shield. Noel Rivera, standing beside her the whole time, placed a shaky hand on her shoulder. That was all. She didn't need comfort. She needed space. Colin turned and walked out. He didn't speak to anyone. Not legal, not the board, not even his executive assistant. He returned to his office with footsteps that sounded heavier than they ever had before. Once inside, he waved his assistant away and locked the door. Then he opened the building's security archive. He already knew the timestamp. He scrubbed backward to when Rena first sat down. The camera angle showed the side of her face, the angle of her shoulders, the stillness of her breath. He watched the footage on slow replay, each frame another flick of a memory he didn't know he'd stored. She worked like she wasn't afraid, like failure didn't belong in the room with her, like the only thing that mattered was the next logical path forward. He paused the feed. There was something in her posture. Arms curled forward, head slightly bowed, fingers still but poised, that cracked something open in him. He tried to ignore it, but the memory came anyway. A dirt path behind the orphanage in Aveline. A girl, no older than 10, kneeling on the stoop with a broken radio in her lap, wires in her mouth, grease on her hands. She never spoke, but she showed up every afternoon. Said that if she fixed the radio, maybe she could hear voices from a better place. One day it sparked. She didn't flinch. She laughed. He had stood there, frozen. And then one day she was gone. No note. No questions. He never asked what happened. Until now. Colin leaned back in his chair. His eyes stung, but he didn't blink. That part of him, whatever it had been, he'd buried years ago beneath conference calls, board reports, and exit strategies. But now that part had clawed its way back through a girl who didn't ask to be noticed, didn't ask for power, just quietly solved a system no one else could. He scrubbed the video again, this time slower, watched her hands, watched her stillness, and then he did something he hadn't done in years. He left the building without telling anyone. No security, no driver, just him, a coat, and a name scribbled on a scratch pad from the janitorial schedule. Danielle Powell. Address listed under a Garden Crest maintenance record. He walked part of the way, asked twice for directions. When the right door opened, a woman stood frozen in the frame, broom in hand, eyes wide. Danielle didn't speak at first. Her instinct was fear. Authority never came to her door with good news. "You're Mr. Thorne?" she asked. He nodded. "She did everything right," he said simply. Danielle didn't move. She didn't trust it. "Not yet. I just wanted to see her world," he added. "I promise it's not disciplinary. It's personal." She nodded, hesitant, and stepped back. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of oil and old plastic. Rena sat on the floor, legs crossed. A tray of wires and resistors splayed around her. She didn't look up. She simply held out a busted walkie-talkie. "Can you fix this one?" she asked.
No greeting. No surprise.
Just a challenge. Colin took it in both hands. I used to, he said. A long time ago. Then try, she said, handing him a screwdriver like she was handing over her notebook. He crouched down. His knees ached. His hands weren't sure anymore. But he tried. In the background, a little boy, her cousin Micah, charged out of the back room with a spoon in one hand and an empty plate in the other. More? He asked. Only if someone flips the next batch, Rena said. Your turn, Micah. He groaned, but headed to the kitchen anyway. Colin blinked. Is he your brother? Cousin, she said. Everyone sort of lives here now. He noticed the mattress against the wall, the dishes in a plastic basin, 3 toothbrushes in one chipped mug. The tiles were cracked, the light flickered, the stove had only one functioning burner. And yet, nothing about the space felt broken. Not truly. Felt focused. He watched as Rena knelt beside Micah and pointed to a capacitor on a half-built circuit. If the charge bleeds too early, she said, the signal fails. You need to match resistance. What's resistance? Micah groaned. She didn't pause. Learn. And Micah did, even if he grumbled about it. Colin didn't interrupt. He just listened. Later, over a plate of misshapen pancakes, Rena passed him a notebook page. It had pancake stains in the margins. But the center was a diagram, some kind of circuit loop meant to store energy in brief pulses. I figured out how to store power without a battery, she said. Only for emergencies. He didn't know how to respond. Not as a CEO. Not even as a person. Just as someone who had been blind to where brilliance actually grew. Not in labs or startup decks, but here, in silence, in hunger, in creative defiance. He left that evening with the diagram tucked into his pocket and something heavier pressing into his chest. Something that stayed with him through 3 missed calls, a legal briefing, and a budget report he didn't read. The next morning, before anyone else arrived, he rewrote Halcyon's internship policy. Minimum GPA? Gone. Age restriction? Gone. Digital portfolio? Optional. Background checks? Deferred. Final authority? His. Then he instructed legal to open a scholarship fund, not for private school prodigies, but for minds like Rena's. Quiet, raw, buried under dust and neglect. Finally, he renamed the rebuilt internal firewall, not Halcyon Shield or Thorn Protocol. He called it Amelia Protect, a whisper of a tribute, subtle, but real. And still he wasn't done, because what Rena had offered him wasn't a PR opportunity. It was a mirror. So he called Danielle himself. Didn't use an assistant. Didn't rehearse. Just dialed the number and asked awkwardly if they could return. For a conversation. No cameras. No press. Just real. When they arrived, he didn't bring them to HR. He brought them to the boardroom. Not because it was symbolic, but because he meant it. He wanted Rena to know the space now included her. She didn't look overwhelmed. If anything, she looked mildly bored. Notebook in hand, Micah at her heels. Danielle sat with her purse clenched in both fists. Colin cleared his throat. You changed how we see everything, he said. Not just systems. People. Potential. Leadership. Danielle teared up almost immediately. Colin continued. I've made changes. There's a scholarship, a mentorship program, access to labs, hardware, learning. He hesitated, then added, if you want it. Rena tilted her head. Will I still be allowed to break things? He blinked, then smiled, his first real smile in years. Yes, he said. That's how we find out what's inside. Danielle sobbed, not loudly, just fully. And Rena, still calm, reached over and held her mother's hand. The room held its silence, thick with meaning. Then Colin passed a small card across the table. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a document. It was a badge. White background. Red trim. One name, Rena. Access level, full. You can come tomorrow, he said. Or next week. Or whenever you're ready. She picked it up, turned it over once, then nodded. I'll come tomorrow. Colin looked out the window then, blinking harder than necessary. He wasn't just giving her a place. She had already carved that out herself. He was giving her what she never asked for but always deserved. Not recognition, but acknowledgement. And for the first time in years, Halcyon didn't just recover from a breach. It gained a center.
Months passed, not with headlines or fanfare, but with quiet consistency. Rena Powell became a fixture at Halcyon Systems, not as a novelty, not as a story passed around meeting rooms, but as a presence. Every morning, she boarded the bus with her mother, Danielle, and sat beside her in the front row. No one else on that bus knew that the little girl in the hoodie had once saved their entire infrastructure from collapse, and Rena never offered to tell them. Her hoodie was still the same, though now the elbows had been stitched and the drawstrings finally matched. Her original notebook had been filled cover to cover, so she'd started a second one. This new volume was thicker and heavier, filled with circuit diagrams, packet flow visualizations, and annotated screenshots of bugs she found in third-party plugins the adults never caught. She never showed it to anyone unless they asked. But inside those pages, Rena was building systems no one had taught her to imagine. She had her own space in the lab now. Not an office, but a designated zone. Her desk wasn't special. Her chair didn't roll, but taped above the monitor, in bold permanent marker, someone had written Rena's brain. No one admitted who wrote it. Rena never erased it. People stopped questioning why she was there. They just included her. Interns brought her snacks when she forgot to eat. Senior engineers left sticky notes on her terminal with questions that started with, "Would you mind taking a look at?" Department heads paused outside her station, just to see what she was building. Rena never performed. She just did the work. She didn't talk much about Halcyon at home, not because she didn't want to, but because some things felt too real to explain out loud. She still scavenged broken electronics from sidewalk trash piles, still dismantled old calculators and DVD players and secondhand toys with exposed circuits, still pulled meaning out of what others had thrown away. Danielle didn't ask many questions. She didn't have to. Every evening when Rena tucked away her badge in the same drawer near the stove, Danielle would place a cup of tea beside her and sit in silence. That small ritual said everything. Back at the office, Colin Thorne changed too, though he was slower to admit it. His schedule was still color-coded to the minute. His meetings still stacked like bricks. But his office was different. On the far end of his desk, just past the double-pane windows, sat a small black frame. Inside it was a single page. Rena's original notebook sketch, the one with the circuits that looked like river paths and tree roots and broken loops folded into perfect patterns. He hadn't scanned it, hadn't digitized it. He just framed the real thing, pencil smudges and all. Sometimes, in the middle of quarterly briefings or budget reviews, his eyes would drift to that page, and he'd remember what it felt like to be cracked open, not by profit loss or media scandal, but by a child with oil-stained fingers who saw systems like languages and broke through them by listening. More than once, he found himself walking down to the lab, not for any official reason, but just to see her work. Rena never asked why he was there. She just nodded once and kept typing. He never stayed long, but she always noticed. And yet, for all the change, Rena never leaned into her own story. She didn't sit for interviews. She didn't give talks. When a tech blogger once tried to offer her a speaking opportunity, she politely declined and returned to debugging an input misfire on a wireless relay. When a local reporter asked for a quote about the breach, she stopped. She simply said, "I liked the problem." That was Rena, not chasing recognition, just chasing what was next. She found puzzles everywhere, in napkin sketches, in test logs, in the subtle inconsistencies of early-stage AI models. Her notebooks filled faster than her backpack could hold them. Her handwriting became smaller, tighter, more layered. Sometimes she'd flip to a page, then flip back, as if chasing something she hadn't finished naming. One night, long after the lab lights had dimmed, she stood quietly in Colin's office. He wasn't there. He'd left hours earlier for dinner with external partners. She didn't sit in his chair, didn't snoop. She just placed something on his desk, a small folded scrap of lined paper. 7 words in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me." That was it. When Colin returned later that night, he didn't expect anything unusual. His office was dim, his desk untouched, but when he saw the folded note, he paused, opened it slowly, read it twice, then a third time. He didn't cry, but he didn't move for a long time either. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like the system he had built defined him. It was the girl who had walked through it and cracked it wide open who reminded him what systems were for. They weren't just for control, they were for connection. And sometimes the most powerful breakthroughs didn't come from the top. They came from the margins. Rena didn't know if she'd ever write code professionally. She didn't know if she'd go to college or invent something big. She didn't even know if she wanted to. But she did know this. She didn't need permission anymore. She already belonged. And somewhere in a glass tower in Newbridge, Colorado, a girl with mismatched shoelaces and a brain full of invisible trees dreamed of something new. And knew, deep in her core, that it mattered, because someone had finally looked at her and said, "Yes, break it. That's how we find out what's inside."